but I'm Ricardo mostly. Tiana Koto, good morning, mabuhay. Thank you very much. It's a pleasure to be here. I used to be a lot in Down Under, but I think it's even more interesting in Down Underwear. I heard that's how you define yourself here. I think the working title, if I can put it that way, is 50 Shades of Hedging. It sounds quite interesting, and I think a good wake-up discussion before lunch today. But I think the reality is more of the good, the bad, and the ugly when it comes to how we in the Southeast Asian region are dealing in the first island chain with the South China Sea dispute. So I'll quickly give a comparative perspective and just a shout out to folks at La Trobe. We did recently a paper, Blue Security, when we look at the policies of Malaysia, Philippines, and Vietnam. And I still have a book stock with, shout out to Melbourne University Press, precisely on this issue of 50 Shades of Hedging and different ways by which we're dealing with this issue. Now, I found the discussion a while ago very interesting because they were almost ontological, right? What are we? Are we a small nation? Are we a big nation? Are we a small nation with supersized responsibilities and borders? And those are the kind of conversations, actually, we're also having in Southeast Asia. I mean, China is just so big, it makes all of us look small. But, last time I checked, countries like the Philippines or Vietnam have population as big as Mexico. And Mexico can be called many things, but I think it has never been called a small country, right? And in that sense, I think a lot of us are coming to terms with the reality that we have enough size, economic growth, heft, and stakes to be, at the very least, emerging middle powers, if not fully emergent middle powers. But before going to specific countries in the region, let me tell you, the more fundamental ontological question we're also raising nowadays in ASEAN is, what is ASEAN? And some of our friends and colleagues, particularly in Singapore, have gone into zoology, and some of them said, is ASEAN a horse or is it a cow? Right? As I said, if it's a cow like the cows you have here, very nutritious and yummy, I would have no problem with that. But in the context of ASEAN discussions, the idea of horse is that, you train it, it's smart, it gets things done, right? And that was the hope for ASEAN. When I was still a student, not long ago, we were discussing ASEAN. Constructivism was the fad during those days. There was a lot of discussion of ASEAN centrality, us being the engine of regional security cooperation, among others. That was the horse conception of ASEAN. But some are wondering if ASEAN nowadays is more of a cow, whereby, it sometimes listens to you, sometimes it munches on that side, and then on that side, and it drifts apart, and you don't know if it's going to reach the destination at all, right? It's a beautiful sight to behold, but you don't know where it's going. Being, of course, a Filipino and an aficionado of Spanish literature, although my Spanish literature is more what we call Carabao, which is more like a cow version of, not very good Spanish yet. My understanding is based on Cervantes and Sancho. I think the best, way forward for ASEAN is to be a donkey, right? Not as fast and efficient as a horse, but it gets things done at a certain level. And that is precisely going to be the context of my conversation today. So I think we went from ontology to zoology. Now let's go to geopolitics. The situation in ASEAN nowadays is quite challenging, to be honest. And this is where I'm going to get a little bit more serious. And that's what we do. We set it up that way. Nowadays, the conversation is, as you know, the keynote speaker at the Shangri-La Dialogue, the most important, aside from this conference, obviously, security dialogue in the region, the keynote speaker was Ferdinand Marcos Jr. of the Philippines. And it was the first time for a Filipino president to have that kind of platform, and I think he did a very good job. I would have almost written the speech similar, so I gave a kudos to some folks up there. And he talked a lot about strategic agency, about how ASEAN, he didn't use the cow and the horse thing, but it has to get things done. ASEAN centrality cannot be just an aspiration. It has to be a reality that is operationalized, and that takes efforts. And then a few days later, you have the Asia-Pacific Roundtable by friends in Malaysia. For some reason, not many Filipinos were invited. And the discussion got very interesting because Anwar Ibrahim, the Prime Minister of Malaysia, gave a very different conception of what is needed for the region. Essentially, enough with these pesky Westerners interfering in our part of the world, and let's just deal with China and everything will be fine. So accordingly, to put it very crudely, the discussion in some capitals, or at least one capital in ASEAN, is, should we have an ASEAN minus the Philippines? Because these Filipinos probably have more in common with the Americans and maybe with you guys than with the rest of us in ASEAN. Interestingly, in the Philippines, we have a mirror effect of that. There's a lot of discussion about Philippines minus ASEAN. I'm the most ardent supporter of ASEAN by saying ASEAN is at best completely useless when it comes to dealing with South China Sea issue. And I'll tell you why that's an optimistic view. Because a lot of my colleagues and friends say, no, ASEAN is not useless. It's less than useless. It's an enabler of China by essentially being a spokesman of China and providing the diplomatic cover for China to push the envelope and create facts on the ground. So this is a very depressing state of affairs for people like me who grew up on this idea that ASEAN is the future of regional cooperation. And it really disheartens me. It's really painful for me to watch this because I was always proud that what we have in Southeast Asia may not be the European Union, although nowadays the EU has its own problems. I don't want to talk about that. But it is at least not the Game of Thrones situation we see in the Middle East and other parts of the world. So what is really the way forward? The way forward is, first of all, we have to have a recognition that, unfortunately, we don't have enough distance from tyranny. And the challenges that we face in the first island chains is pretty serious. In the case of the Philippines, we're a double frontline state because on one hand, we're an active participant in the scramble in the South China Sea and probably, I would say, the only country nowadays that is calling out China when it comes to their aggressive activities in that part of the world. In many ways, we're doing everything that we're supposed to do during 6 years of Duterte, so that's why everything's times two. We're doing a catch-up. Because during Duterte, I think the Philippines was competing with Cambodia in terms of loyalty award to China, who's the best friend of China, at least as far as the statements of the president was concerned. But the other thing that makes the Philippines also very important is Taiwan, the Taiwan question. Manila as a capital is just over 1 hour from Taipei. Well, it takes, forever to get here, but it takes 3 or 4 hours to go to Singapore, if there's any direct flight to Jakarta once in a while and all. So the geography is really staring us in the face. And then you have other ASEAN countries who have a completely different dynamic, right? When it comes to Vietnam, of course, there's discussion of all of this myth. The most famous version is 1,000 years of resistance to China. I saw a more interesting piece from 1984 in Washington Post where a Vietnamese official told this American counterpart, we have 4,000 years of resistance against China, which also raised some ontological question. Was there really a Vietnam or China back then? But never mind. My problem is that doesn't capture the complexity of the situation right now in a country like Vietnam, which is going tremendous amount of domestic political transition, to put it mildly, right? And because of geography, they're just right next to China and right next to very good friends of China, i.e. Cambodia. That really shapes their options and structures the kind of responses that they can provide. Not to mention, China is a huge investor in Vietnam, and Vietnam's manufacturing future and economic prosperity in many ways is tied right now to China, and not to mention party-to-party ties, Communist Party to Communist Party ties. And in fact, if you look at the more securocrats who are taking over Vietnam nowadays, their number one worry probably is not the South China Sea, it's more color revolutions. And I'd rather take them seriously, and this is my understanding of conversing with our friends in Hanoi over the past 10 years. The conversation is having a completely different complexion from what I observed 10 years ago when we were trying to be best friends when it comes to dealing with China on the South China Sea issue, especially after the Philippines decided to take China to the court in South China Sea. I notice I'm talking too fast. It must be the coffee. You have very good coffee here. Much better than the huge coffee in huge hotels we have back there in Southeast Asia. And then you go to the case of Malaysia, which is, and this is where the whole 50 Shades comes in, because I really don't know. Like, during first year of Mahathir, we have it over Manila, we have a nice chat, nice interview. It's all about China threat. 6 months later, he gets a discount on some of the BR projects. He's completely speaking on the other side of the pond, right? Anwar Ibrahim, we were expecting him to be a good friend of ours, a Filipinist, opposition leader, an icon. And nowadays, from what I hear, he goes all around the world and saying, we are not the Philippines. We're going to do things very differently, right? And I think he has been pretty clear and transparent about that. And my worry here right now is, you have on one hand countries like the Philippines which are saying, what on earth is ASEAN going to do about this? Because options for us are very limited. We don't have sufficient capabilities to stand up to China, so we're being forced essentially into adding to the acronyms, including JAFUS, Japan, Philippine, US Alliance, or a more interesting acronym, not really an acronym, but the Squad, right? I call it the real Quad, right? Together with Australia, together with United States and Japan. That's a purely defensive position. And of course, also getting more active on the Taiwan front, because we cannot afford to have China as our immediate neighbor, right? It will have huge implication for us, and we cannot be neutral if things go down to war. So on one hand, there are these issue about how can we exercise strategic agency as far as ASEAN is concerned. But at the same time, I feel that there's also a lot of strategic fatalism in this region, in the sense that it's just inevitable for China to have our part of the world as its quote-unquote sphere of influence. And they use quote-unquote realism, not really realistic, but realism to kind of justify that and deal with that. And I'll just throw this in. The biggest issue in key capitals like Kuala Lumpur and Indonesia nowadays is Gaza conflict. It's not Ukraine, it's not the South China Sea. It's a totally different kind of conversation. In fact, if you go into multiple capitals, you go from Manila to Kuala Lumpur, you're almost in a political multiverse, right? Whereby levels of discussion have completely different manifestation, and then in Vietnam is a totally different ballgame. So this is where my worry comes in. Nevertheless, I'm going towards the end of my discussion. Minilateralism seems to be the best option forward in absence of a serious reconsideration of the broken multilateralism that we have in ASEAN. I will contest, I used to be very skeptical of this, but when the Philippines unilaterally pushed for the arbitration case against China, a lot of us were skeptical. And a lot in ASEAN openly criticized that as saying, this is provocative and all. But today, I look at legal positioning of Malaysia when they're pushing for the extended continental shelf in the South China Sea. I look at what Indonesia is saying when there's intrusion to the North Natuna Sea. I look at what the Vietnamese are doing when it comes to threatening legal warfare. All of them are using the arbitration award that we pushed unilaterally because no one was there to support us, and few have supported us openly on this as far as Southeast Asian region is concerned. So sometimes by insisting on a broken, dysfunctional multilateralism, you're not really helping ASEAN. And perhaps ASEAN can be a horse when it comes to economic integration and cultural issue. But I think when it comes to matters of geopolitics, we saw the limitations in Myanmar, and we don't want the same disaster or the same levels of disaster in the South China Sea. I think we can get at least a donkey situation through minilateralism among these countries. So despite the skepticism that I expressed here, let me end on a more positive note or cautiously positive note. I still believe in personal diplomacy. The biggest challenge we have had in ASEAN is that for decades, strong, big men, sometimes dictators, really could work it out among themselves. You had the Lee Kuan Yews and Suhartos and Marcoses, but they didn't build the strong institutions. So unfortunately, we're paying the price for the vacuum of leadership afterwards. But I still have confidence in the Anwar Ibrahims and the Marcoses and the leaders across the region, and Prabowo, especially in Indonesia, will be very, very influential in shaping the agenda and direction of the region to come together and have that kind of conversation, because I think minilateralism perhaps is the best way forward. We may not get 10 out of 10 in terms of making ASEAN central, but if we can get 6 out of 10 in terms of enforcing a spirit of norms-based approach to international law and rules-based order in the region, then that's good enough to me. On that note, thank you very much, and looking forward to your criticisms and violent reactions. Thank you very much.